A rejected horse was sold to a mountain man for just $1. But no one expected what happened next. On the dusty edge of a frontier town, a beaten, worthless horse is mocked and left for dead. But one rugged mountain man steps forward. With a single coin and a heart burdened by loss, what begins as a foolish bargain soon becomes a fight for dignity, family, and faith. When a widow and her half-Apache boy arrive at his cabin, the broken horse carries their hopes and their survival, but whispers spread fast. A powerful rancher claims the horse was never his to buy, and he'll use the sheriff, the law, and even a loaded gun to take it back. As church bells toll and jail keys rattle, the Mustang stands tall, guarding the boy from a deadly strike. The whole town watches, stunned. Will this rejected horse save more than a family's future? Or will greed and prejudice crush the last chance for redemption on the frontier? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now and if this story speaks to you. Make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Morning wind whipped dust across the auction yard, making the gathered horses stamp and snort. Ranchers in weathered hats clustered around the better animals, ignoring the skeletal Mustang that huddled in the corner pen. Its ribs showed clear. As fence rails beneath a patchy coat and old scars crossed its flanks like pale lightning. "Next up, folks," the auctioneer called out, his voice carrying across the yard. Though I reckon calling this one a horse might be stretching the truth. He gestured at the trembling Mustang, earning scattered chuckles from the crowd. The Mustang's head hung low, its matted mane falling over eyes that had seen too much hardship. A fresh rope burn marked its neck, testament to a rough capture from the wild. Most of the townsfolk didn't even bother moving closer to look. "Won't even make good dog food," one rancher spat, turning away. "Ain't worth the bullet to put it down." Auctioneer's smile grew strained as no bids came forward. Well now, surely someone sees some value here. His practiced cheer couldn't mask the impatience in his voice. "No? Then I suppose we'll have to." The deep voice cut through the morning air like an axe through pine. The crowd parted, revealing Frank Boone standing at the back. His buckskin jacket bore the wear of mountain winters, and his eyes held the quiet of high places where few men ventured. Laughter rippled through the gathering. "Lost your sense, along with your solitude," Boone called out. Tom Wheeler, one of the larger ranchers. "That nag ain't fit to carry saddle nor pack." Frank didn't respond, just reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver dollar. The coin caught the morning light as he walked forward, his boots leaving clear prints in the dusty ground. The Mustang's ears pricked forward at his approach, tracking his movement. "Well now," the auctioneer said, recovering his showman's voice, "we have a bid of $1 from Frank Boone. Any other takers?" He paused for effect, but the crowd had already started drifting away, shaking their heads at the foolishness they'd witnessed. Sold then to the mountain man for $1. Frank handed over his coin without ceremony. He approached the pen slowly, speaking low words that didn't carry to the dispersing crowd. The Mustangs, trembling, eased slightly as Frank opened the gate and gently took hold of the lead rope. "You're burning daylight and money," Boone Wheeler called out as Frank led the horse past. "That beast won't last a week in the mountains." Frank's only response was to keep walking his steady pace, matching the Mustang's halting steps. They made an odd pair leaving Town the Tall. Weather-worn man and the broken-down horse butt, there was something fitting in how they moved together. To creatures more at home in the wild places than behind town fences. The sun tracked west. As they followed the trail into the mountains, Frank stopped often, letting the horse rest and offering water from his canteen. Each time he spoke quiet words of encouragement, and each time the Mustang's eyes grew a little less wild with fear. By the time dusk painted the pine trees purple, they'd reached Frank's cabin. It wasn't much a simple log structure with a tin roof and a small corral, but smoke rose welcoming from the chimney, where he'd banked the morning's fire. Inside, Frank stirred up the coals and set a pot of beans to warm while he tended to the Mustang. He worked by lantern light, cleaning the worst of the rope burns and checking the animal's hooves. The horse accepted his ministrations with increasing trust, something in Frank's patient hands easing years of hurt. "Reckon we both know what it's like being cast aside," Frank said softly, running a brush over the tangled mane. The lantern hissed gently, and somewhere in the darkness a coyote called, "But that don't mean we ain't worth something." He paused in his grooming, considering. Think I'll call you Promise. Seems fitting, seeing as how we're making one to each other right now. Promise snickered softly, pressing his nose against Frank's shoulder. In that moment, watching the starlight catch in the horse's eyes, Frank felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the grief that had wound tight around his heart since losing his wife. It wasn't healing, not yet, but it was a start. The beans simmered on the fire, filling the cabin with their homely smell as Frank continued his quiet work. Promise stood steady now, barely flinching when the brush found tender spots. Both man and horse had found something they needed, a second chance, offered without judgment and accepted with growing trust. The mountain morning dawned clear and cool, sunlight filtering through the pine branches to dapple Frank's cabin clearing. Promise stood quietly in the corral, his head lifted to catch the breeze that rustled down from the peaks. Frank approached with a bucket of warm water and clean rags, moving slow and steady so as not to startle the horse. "Gonna tend to those hurts of yours," he said softly, setting down his supplies. The morning light revealed the full extent of Promise's injuries, rope burns raw around his neck, patches of skin rubbed bare from ill-fitting harness, and older scars that told tales of hard handling. Frank dipped a rag in the warm water and began cleaning the wounds with gentle strokes. As he worked, a tune rose unbidden to his lips, Amazing Grace, his wife Sarah's favorite hymn. His voice was rough from disuse, more suited to mountain silence than song, but Promise's ears swiveled toward the sound. "Sarah would have known just how to fix you up proper," Frank said, carefully applying salve to the rope burns. "She had a way with hurt creatures. Nursed every injured bird and rabbit the good Lord sent her way." His hands stilled for a moment. "Ain't said much to him myself these past few years, not since he left the thought unfinished, focusing instead on working the healing ointment into Promise's wounds." The horse stood patient under his ministrations, only flinching slightly when Frank found particularly tender spots. Taking up a brush, Frank began working at the tangles in Promise's mane. The snarls were fierce, evidence of years without proper care, Sarah used to say. "Every creature deserves gentleness," he continued, carefully teasing apart the knots. Reckon she was right about that, like she was about most things. The morning passed in quiet industry as Frank tended to his new charge. By the time the sun stood high, Promise's coat gleamed a bit brighter, his mane falling in smoother waves. Despite the patches where it had been torn out, "Time we saw what you can do," Frank said, bringing out his old saddle. He took extra care with the fitting, patting the worn spots that might rub. Promise tensed, but allowed himself to be saddled, trust growing with each careful touch. Frank led Promise in a slow circle around the clearing, watching the horse's gait. Promise moved with obvious stiffness, stumbling now and then on the uneven ground, but each time he faltered, he caught himself and pressed on, showing a determination that spoke of deep reserves of strength. "Got some grit in you," Frank observed, patting Promise's neck. "Just need time to remember it." As evening approached, Frank settled onto his cabin's rough-hewn porch, pipe in hand. The tobacco smoke curled up into the darkening sky, while Promise dozed nearby, tethered loose enough to graze if he wished. The peaceful scene stirred something in Frank's memory. Reaching inside, he retrieved a worn Bible from beside his bed. Its leather cover was smooth from years of handling, though most of that wear had come from Sarah's hands, not his. Frank ran his fingers over the familiar texture before opening to where a faded ribbon marked the Psalms. "The Lord is my shepherd," he read aloud, voice carrying clear in the evening stillness. "I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." Promise's ears twitched at the sound, his head lifting to catch the words. Frank continued, reading as darkness gathered, speaking the ancient verses into the deepening dusk. Something about the familiar cadence eased an ache he'd carried so long, he'd almost forgotten its presence. When the light grew too dim to make out the words, Frank sat quietly, pipe forgotten in his hand. Promise stood close by, his presence somehow companionable in the gathering night. Neither man nor horse seemed inclined to break the peaceful silence. Eventually, Frank moved inside, stoking the hearth fire against the mountain chill. He settled in his chair, intending to read a bit more. But the day's work and the evening's peace soon had his head nodding. The Bible remained open in his lap as he drifted off, its pages catching the firelight while Promise's soft breathing drifted in through the open door. In that moment between waking and sleep, Frank felt something shift inside him like spring, ice breaking up on a mountain stream. He couldn't name it yet, this tentative warmth that had begun to thaw his frozen grief. But it was there, as real as Promise's steady presence outside and the familiar words waiting on the Bible's open pages. The sharp ring of Frank's axe echoed through the clearing as he split logs for winter. 2 days had passed since Promise's arrival, and the routine of caring for the injured horse had settled into a comfortable rhythm. The morning sun warmed his shoulders as he worked, pausing only to wipe sweat from his brow. A distant creak caught his attention. Frank lowered his axe, listening as the sound grew closer, wagon wheels straining against rough terrain. Through the trees, a weathered wagon appeared, swaying dangerously over the uneven ground. A woman held the reins, her face drawn with exhaustion. Beside her, a small boy huddled against her side, clutching a threadbare blanket as if it might shield him from the world. Their horse stumbled the last few steps into the clearing. Its legs trembled with fatigue before its knees buckled, bringing the wagon to an abrupt halt. The animal lay in the dirt, sides heaving with labored breath. Frank set his axe aside and approached, his steps measured. "Ma'am, you all right?" The woman straightened her spine, though weariness showed in every line of her face. "I'm Ruth Larkspur. This is my son, Thomas." Her voice carried the practiced calm of someone used to facing hardship. "We're headed west, but our horse..." She gestured helplessly at the fallen animal. Thomas remained silent, dark eyes watching Frank from beneath a mop of black hair. The boy's features held hints of Apache heritage, and Frank noticed fresh tears. In Ruth's dress, the kind that came from rough handling rather than wear. "Town gave you trouble?" Frank asked quietly. Ruth's shoulders tensed. They made their feelings clear about. She drew Thomas closer. "About us," Frank nodded, understanding filling the silence. "Got water in the well there," he said, pointing. "And food inside. Best tend to your horse first, though." He moved to examine the fallen animal, running experienced hands over its legs and flanks. The horse's condition told a story of too many miles with too little rest. Frank shook his head. "Won't be going far on this one. Needs days of rest, maybe weeks if it recovers at all." Ruth's face fell, but she squared her shoulders. "We're much obliged for the water, Mr. Boone. Frank Boone." He gestured toward his cabin. "Got a stew on the fire. You and the boy are welcome to it." Inside the cabin, Frank ladled thick bean stew into tin bowls, while Ruth helped Thomas settle at the rough-hewn table. The boy hadn't spoken a word, but his eyes took in everything, darting between Frank and the door as if planning escape routes. "Lord's blessing on this food," Ruth murmured, and Frank noticed how she stretched each spoonful, making sure Thomas ate his fill before taking much herself. He quietly added more to their bowls when they were half-dash empty. As the sun began to set, Frank led them to the barn. "Can bed down here tonight," he said, pointing to clean straw and spare blankets. "It's warm enough." A soft nickering drew their attention. Promise stood in his stall, head extended curiously toward the newcomers. To Frank's surprise, Thomas took a step forward, his first independent movement since arriving. The boy's hand reached out tentatively as Promise stretched to sniff his fingers. The corners of Thomas's mouth twitched upward, not quite a smile, but the closest thing to it Frank had seen. Promise gentled, his head down, and Thomas's small hand brushed the horse's forelock. Ruth watched the interaction, wonder and worry mingling in her expression. "We shouldn't impose," she began, but Frank cut her off with a gentle wave. "Ain't imposing. If you're invited," he said simply, "barn's got plenty of room." As Frank turned to leave them settled for the night, Ruth's voice stopped him. "Mr. Boone?" He looked back to find her gazing at Thomas, who still stood by Promise's stall. "I've been wondering all day what made us take this trail instead of the main road." She met Frank's eyes. "Maybe Providence had a hand in leading us." Here, Frank nodded slowly, watching as Promise nudged Thomas's shoulder with surprising gentleness. "Could be," he said softly. "Could be." Morning light filtered through the barn's weathered boards as Ruth stood beside her fallen horse. The animal's breathing had steadied overnight, but its legs still trembled at any attempt to rise. She turned to Frank, who was checking the wagon's wheels. "Without a draft horse, we cannot move forward," she admitted, her voice tight with worry. "But I cannot ask more of your hospitality, Mr. Boone." Frank straightened, brushing dust from His hands as he studied the wagon, his gaze drifted to Promise's stall, where the Mustang watched them with alert eyes. The horse's wounds were healing, though scars still marked his hide. "Reckon we could try something," Frank said slowly. "Promise ain't never pulled weight before, but he's got spirit in him." Ruth's eyes widened. The Mustang. But surely he's too small for size. "Ain't everything," Frank interrupted gently. "Sometimes the strongest heart comes in the least likely package." He moved to Promise's stall, speaking softly as he fitted the horse with worn leather harness straps. The Mustang's ears flicked back and forth, uncertain but trusting. Thomas crept closer to watch, his small frame half hidden behind a post. Frank led Promise to the wagon's front, carefully attaching the traces. The horse shifted nervously, metal chains jingling. "Easy now," Frank murmured, running a steady hand down Promise's neck. "Ain't nothing here to fear." Ruth helped Thomas onto the wagon seat, while Frank took position beside Promise's head. The horse pawed the ground, muscles tensing as he felt the wagon's weight behind him. "Walk on," Frank commanded softly. Promise took one step, then balked, sides heaving. Frank didn't pull or force him. Instead, he began to hum, the notes of amazing grace floating through the morning air. Promise's ears swiveled toward the sound. Frank maintained the gentle melody, and the horse took another tentative step, then another. The wagon creaked into motion. "Oh!" Ruth gasped as they began to roll forward. Promise's stride grew more confident with each step, his head lifting higher. A whisper came from the wagon seat, so faint it was nearly lost in the sound of turning wheels. "Good horse," Thomas breathed, his first words since arriving. "You can do it." Promise's ears flicked back at the boy's voice, and his pace steadied. Frank kept humming, leading them across the clearing. The Mustang's muscles bunched and strained, but he didn't falter. Sweat darkened his coat, yet determination showed in every line of his body. When they reached the clearing's far edge, Frank called a halt. Promise stood breathing heavily, but his head remained high. Pride shone in Frank's eyes as he patted the horse's neck. "Well done, friend," he murmured. "Knew you had it in you." Ruth climbed down from the wagon, her movements careful as she approached Promise. "I would never have believed it," she said softly. "Thank you, Mr. Boone, both for believing in him and for helping us." Frank nodded, beginning to unhitch Promise from the wagon. The morning's work had proven what he'd suspected since the auction. This cast-off horse had more heart than any prized stallion in town. As evening approached, Frank added extra cornmeal to his usual bean pot. The cabin filled with warm cooking, smells as Ruth helped by kneading a batch of cornbread. Thomas sat at the table, sketching shapes in spilled flour with one finger. When the food was ready, they gathered around Frank's sturdy table. Ruth offered a quiet blessing, and for a while, there was only the comfortable sounds of shared supper. "The wagon moves well enough now," Ruth said finally, breaking the peaceful silence. "But I fear what awaits us in town. We need supplies." Yet after last time, she trailed off, her hand unconsciously moving to a tear in her sleeve. Frank set down his spoon, his expression thoughtful but determined. "Let them try," he said simply, the words carrying weight in their quietness. Ruth looked up, surprise crossing her features at the steady strength in his voice. She saw then what she hadn't fully noticed before: the careful way he moved, the watchful eyes that missed nothing, the calm confidence of a man who knew his own capabilities. Thomas glanced between them, then down at his plate, but his shoulders had relaxed slightly, as if his mother's tension easing had allowed him to do the same. The evening settled around them like a warm blanket as they finished their meal. Outside, Promise's occasional soft nickering drifted from the barn, a reminder of unexpected strength and hidden worth. Inside, three people who had started the day as strangers found themselves sharing something that felt surprisingly like hope. The following morning dawned clear and cool. Frank adjusted Promise's saddle straps with care, checking each buckle twice. The horse stood quietly, head lowered, in trust as Frank worked. "Just a supply run into town," Frank murmured, stroking Promise's neck. "Nothing to fret over." The ride down the mountain trail proved Promise's sure-footedness. Where other horses might stumble, the Mustang picked his way carefully over loose rocks and around tight switchbacks. Frank sat easy in the saddle, letting Promise find his own pace. As they approached Silver Bluff's dusty Main Street, The usual bustle of morning trade slowed. Folks stopped their errands to stare. Promise's ears twitched at the attention, but he maintained his steady walk. That the worthless Mustang from auction, someone whispered loud enough to carry, can't be. Another voice answered, that horse is bearing weight and responding to commands. Frank dismounted outside the general store, tying Promise to the hitching post. He could feel eyes following his movements, hear the rustle of gossip spreading down the street. Promise stood calmly, head high, his coat beginning to show a healthy shine after days of proper care. The store bell jingled as Frank stepped inside. He was selecting coffee beans when boot heels clicked on the wooden floor behind him. Frank turned to find Clinton Maddox filling the doorway. The rancher's expensive vest stretched tight across his chest. "That's my stock out there," Maddox declared, jerking his thumb toward Promise. "Horse was culled from my herd, never properly sold." Frank continued measuring coffee into a paper sack. "Bought him fair at auction?" he replied evenly. "Got the receipt right here." He patted his shirt pocket. $1 ain't a proper sale price," Maddox sneered. "More like theft, way I see it." The store grew quiet as other customers edged away from the tension. Frank sealed his coffee sack before meeting Maddox's glare. "Price was set by your auctioneer," Frank said. "Deal's done." Sheriff Graves chose that moment to enter his badge, catching the morning light. He glanced between the two men, then settled his gaze on Frank. "Might want to prepare yourself to return that animal," Boone the sheriff warned, his tone carefully neutral. "If Mr. Maddox has prior claim, he don't," Frank interrupted. "Horse was sold legal. Nothing more to discuss." Frank paid for his supplies and walked out, aware of Maddox's hard stare following him. Promise nickered softly as Frank approached, earning a gentle pat on his forelock. Frank secured his purchases and mounted up, steering Promise toward home without another word. Sun was setting when Frank reached his cabin. Ruth met him at the door, Thomas hovering behind her skirts. One look at Frank's face told her something was wrong. "There's trouble," she said. It wasn't a question. Frank nodded, carrying his supplies inside. As he put away the goods, he described the confrontation in town. Ruth's face grew more worried with each detail. Clinton Maddox. She sank into a chair, hands twisted in her apron. "That man holds half the county in his pocket. When he wants something," she trailed off, shoulders tense with old fear. "Been driven out before, ain't you?" Frank asked quietly. Ruth nodded, drawing Thomas close. 3 towns back. Different men, same story. Those with power decide what's right, and those without must bend. "Not this time," Frank said. His voice was soft but carried iron certainty. Thomas looked up at Frank with wide eyes. "Will they take Promise away?" Frank crouched down to the boy's level. "No, son. Promise belongs with us now. That's God's truth, and all Maddox's money can't change it." The lamp on the table cast flickering shadows as evening deepened. Ruth stared into the flame, her face drawn with worry. "I've seen how this ends," she whispered. "The sheriff looks away. Good people stay silent, and families like mine are forced to move on." Frank placed another log in the stove, the fire's warmth pushing back the gathering dark. "You and Thomas are safe here," he said firmly. "Ain't nobody driving you out. Not while I draw breath." Ruth studied his face, searching for any hint of uncertainty. Finding none, she straightened her shoulders slightly. Outside, Promise's soft nickering drifted from the barn, peaceful and assured. Inside, 3 people who had found unexpected shelter with each other sat in companionable silence, drawing strength from shared warmth and quiet determination. The mountain air turned crisp. As autumn crept closer, over the next few days, the cabin's clearing rang with the steady rhythm of work. Ruth balanced carefully on the cabin's roof, replacing worn shingles with practiced hands. Her movements were sure, speaking of years spent maintaining her own homestead. "Pass up another bundle," she called down to Frank. He handed up more cedar shakes, watching her work with quiet admiration. "Reckon you've done this before?" "A widow learns to do everything," Ruth replied, driving nails with swift strikes. "Or nothing gets done at all." Below, Thomas stood in the yard, learning to split kindling under Frank's guidance. His small hands gripped the hatchet handle uncertainly at first. "Like this," Frank demonstrated, showing how to place the wood. "Steady now. let the weight of the blade do the work. Thomas's face screwed up in concentration as he brought the hatchet down. The wood split with a satisfying crack. A rare smile flickered across the boy's face. "Well done," Frank praised softly. Thomas ducked his head, pleased. Promise grazed nearby, his coat beginning to shine with health. The horse lifted his head occasionally to watch them work, seeming content in their presence. Thomas would pause between logs to stroke Promise's nose or offer him bits of apple. Though still quiet, the boy had begun speaking in short phrases, usually directed at the horse. "You're getting stronger," Thomas whispered to Promise one afternoon, running a brush over the horse's flank. "Just like Papa's stories said mustangs are tough." Ruth watched from her mending spot on the porch, needle flashing in the sunlight. Without realizing it, she found herself humming hymns as she worked songs she hadn't sung since before Thomas's father died. The familiar melodies brought comfort rather than pain for the first time in years. Late one afternoon, as shadows lengthened across the yard, hoofbeats announced a visitor. A traveling preacher rode up, his black coat dusty from the trail. "Might I trouble you for water?" he asked, removing his broad-brimmed hat. "For myself and my horse." "Of course," Frank replied, drawing a fresh bucket from the well. The preacher's keen eyes took in the scene, Frank's solitary cabin, now holding this unlikely household. He watched Thomas lead Promise to drink alongside his own mount. "The Lord often works through the despised and rejected," the preacher remarked thoughtfully. "Those the world casts aside, he, gathering to himself, like that fine horse there, clearly once unwanted, now standing proud and strong." Frank's hands stilled on the well rope. The words struck deep, though he kept his face carefully neutral. He thought of his own isolation after losing his wife, of Ruth and Thomas driven from town after town, of Promise trembling at auction. All of them wounded, yet finding healing together. "You speak truth, preacher," Frank said quietly. After the preacher rode on, evening settled over the cabin. Rain began to patter on the newly repaired roof, a soothing rhythm in the growing dark. Frank built up the fire while Ruth tucked Thomas into his bedroll near the hearth. Later, as Thomas slept, Ruth sat at the rough-hewn table, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee. Firelight caught the worry in her eyes. "What future can Thomas have?" she asked softly. "A boy of mixed blood, unwelcome in both worlds." "I fear for him, Frank. Fear what life will deal him." Frank was quiet for a long moment, considering his words. Carefully, "Reckon the future ain't written yet. Boy's got strength in him, like his mama, and he won't face it alone." "You mean that?" Ruth's voice held cautious hope. "You'd stand with us?" "Already am," Frank replied simply. "Whatever comes." Ruth's eyes grew bright with unshed tears. She looked around the cabin at Thomas's sleeping, peacefully, at the sturdy roof overhead, at the flames dancing in the hearth. For the first time in years, the word home whispered in her heart. "Thank you," she whispered. Frank nodded, understanding all she left unsaid. Outside, rain drummed steadily on the cedar shakes while Promise whickered softly in the barn. Inside, warmth and trust grew between three lonely souls, learning to be family. Thomas stirred in his sleep, murmuring something about horses. Ruth smoothed his dark hair gently, then returned to her mending by firelight. Frank added another log to the flames, its gentle crackling filling the comfortable silence. The rough cabin walls seemed to glow with newfound warmth, sheltering them all from the darkness beyond. The darkness beyond. Sunday morning painted the mountains in golden light. Ruth stood before a cracked mirror in Frank's cabin, smoothing her best dress with trembling hands. Her reflection showed the worry lines around her eyes, deeper than usual. "Thomas needs proper worship," she said firmly, though her voice wavered. "He needs to know God's house should welcome all his children." Frank nodded, adjusting his rarely worn collar. He had scrubbed his hands until the trapline grime was gone, though calluses remained. "Reckon you're right about that." Thomas emerged from behind the quilt that sectioned off his sleeping area, wearing his one good shirt. His dark eyes were solemn as Ruth wetted a comb to smooth his hair. Outside, Frank hitched Promise to the wagon with careful hands. The Mustang stood quietly, his coat gleaming from yesterday's thorough brushing. Gone was the trembling, scarred creature from the oxen. In his place stood a horse with quiet dignity, head held high. "You clean up fine," Frank told Promise, straightening the harness. The horse nickered softly in response. Ruth helped Thomas onto the wagon seat, then accepted Frank's hand up beside him. The morning air held autumn's crispness as they set out. Wagon wheels crunching on the trail that wound down toward Silver Bluff, Promise's steady gait, carried them past pine forests and into town. His hooves clicked against the packed dirt of Main Street, drawing stares from early churchgoers. Ladies in their Sunday best paused on the boardwalk, fans fluttering as they whispered behind gloved hands. Men's conversations died mid. As the unlikely trio passed, "Look at that Mustang now," someone muttered, walking proud as any thoroughbred. And those three, came another whisper, bold as brass. Coming to church, Frank kept his eyes forward, one hand steady on the reins. Ruth sat straight-backed beside him, though her fingers twisted in her skirts. Thomas pressed close to her side. Watching the townsfolk through his dark lashes, they pulled up before the white-painted church just as the bell began to toll. Promise stood calmly as Frank helped Ruth and Thomas down from the wagon. Other families climbing the steps slowed to stare, some with curiosity, others with poorly hidden disdain. The traveling preacher from earlier that week stood in the doorway. His weathered face creased in a genuine smile as he extended his hand. To them, "Welcome, welcome," he said warmly. "I'm gratified to see you here." His eyes held Frank's for a meaningful moment as he quoted, "The stone, which the builders rejected, is become the cornerstone." Ruth's shoulders relaxed slightly at his greeting. Thomas stayed close to her skirts as they found a pew near the back. Frank sat at the end, his large frame somehow less imposing in his Sunday clothes. The organ wheezed to life, and the congregation rose for the opening hymn. Ruth's clear voice lifted in the familiar melody, steady despite the sideways glances. Then Thomas surprised them all by whispering along, his small voice joining his mother's on the chorus. Frank found himself humming, remembering how his wife had loved this very hymn through the sermon. Thomas sat quietly, his eyes wide as he took in the painted windows and wooden cross. Ruth followed along in the shared Bible, her finger tracing the verses. Frank listened intently, something in his heart softening at the words of grace and redemption. After the final amen, they made their way back outside. Promise stood patiently by the hitching post, his presence drawing curious looks from the departing congregation. A few children edged closer, drawn by the horse's gentle eye. "Can we pet him?" a small girl asked, looking uncertainly at Frank. Frank nodded. "Gentle now. He's friendly enough." The children approached slowly, reaching out to stroke Promise's neck. The horse lowered his head, allowing their touch with quiet dignity. Thomas watched from Ruth's side, then stepped forward to demonstrate how Promise liked to be scratched. Behind his ears, "He was scared before," Thomas told the other children softly. "But not anymore. He's brave now." For a brief, precious moment, the barriers fell away. Thomas stood among the other children, showing them how to offer Promise an apple core. Ruth exchanged tentative smiles with some of the mothers. Frank found himself sharing notes about horse care with one of the farmers. The sun rode high as they drove home, Promise's steady gait carrying them back up the mountain trail. The morning's tension had eased, leaving behind a fragile hope that evening, as Ruth heated soup for supper, she caught Frank's rare smile as he watched Thomas curry Promise in the yard. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for today, for everything." Frank ducked his head, unused to gratitude, but the smile lingered, warming his weathered face. For the first time in years, the ache of loneliness had eased. Here, in this unlikely family, he was beginning to feel the stirrings of belonging once more. Morning sunlight streamed through the cabin windows as Frank scraped the last bits of breakfast from his tin plate. Ruth hummed while washing dishes, and Thomas sat cross-legged on the floor, whittling a small piece of pine wood. The peaceful scene shattered at the sound of approaching FOFBEATS. Frank rose from his chair, his shoulders tensing as he moved to the doorway. Outside, Deputy Wilson rode up on his bay gelding, dust coating his boots. Papers rustled in his hand as he dismounted. "Morning, Boone," the deputy said, trying to sound official despite his obvious discomfort. "Got some legal business here." Frank stood firmly in the doorway, filling its frame. The deputy held out the documents, clearing his throat. "Mr. Maddox has filed a formal claim of ownership on that Mustang you bought. Sheriff says you're to surrender the animal immediately." Inside the cabin, Ruth's hands stilled in the wash basin. Water dripped in the sudden silence as Frank took the papers, his weathered fingers careful not to tear them. "This here's a legitimate bill of sale from the auction," Frank said quietly. "Paid my dollar fair and square. Maddox claims the horse was his cull stock, never properly released for sale." The deputy shifted his weight, not quite meeting Frank's eyes. "Says there was a mix-up at the holding pens." "No mix-up." Frank's voice hardened. "I won't be handing over promise to that man." Thomas crept closer to Ruth, his small hands clutching her skirts. The wooden figure he'd been carving fell forgotten to the floor. The deputy's face reddened. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Boone. I'll have to come back with force if you refuse. Then I reckon you'll have to do that." Frank handed the papers back, his movements deliberate and calm. After the deputy rode away, Ruth's trembling became visible. She gripped the edge of the wash basin, knuckles white. "Frank, what if they don't just come for promise?" What if she couldn't finish, but her meaning was clear? They could all be driven out. Frank opened his mouth to reassure her, but voices drifted up from the trail below. Thomas slipped outside before anyone could stop him, moving silently to the edge of the clearing. "Ought to send that half-breed back to the reservation where he belongs," a harsh voice carried on the wind. "Ain't natural, having his kind mixing with decent folk." Thomas stumbled backward as though struck. The precious confidence he'd gained at church crumbled in his eyes. He ran past Frank and Ruth, diving behind the quilt that sectioned off his sleeping area. Ruth followed, murmuring soft words in Apache and English. But Thomas remained huddled beneath his blanket, shaking as evening settled over the mountain. Frank paced the cabin's wooden floors. Each board creaked beneath his boots as he wrestled with his thoughts. The law stood with Maddox, but the law had stood with many wrongs before. Ruth watched him from her chair by the fire, her sewing forgotten in her lap. "Remember what the preacher said?" she asked softly. "About the stone the builders rejected." Frank's pacing slowed. "Been a long time since I put much stock in such things. Maybe that's why the Lord brought promise to you," Ruth said, "to remind you he hasn't forgotten either of you." Frank stopped by the window, gazing out at the stars appearing. Above the pines, his wife's face floated in his memory, how she'd always knelt to pray when troubles came, her faith steady as the mountains themselves. Slowly, Frank lowered himself to his knees beside his chair, his hands rough from years of trapping and hard work, clasped awkwardly in prayer. The words came haltingly at first, whispered into the quiet cabin. "Lord, it's been a while." He swallowed hard. "Sarah always knew how to talk to you proper, but I reckon you can hear me just the same. We need your strength now. All of us, me, Ruth, Thomas, even that broken horse you saw fit to bring us." Ruth's hand touched his arm, warm and reassuring. From behind the quilt, Thomas's sniffling quieted as he listened. "Show us the way through this," Frank continued, his voice growing steadier. "Help us stand for what's right, even when it ain't easy. And thank you for bringing these two to my door. Amen." As if in answer, promise nickered from the barn, the soft sound carrying through the evening air. The horse's gentle call seemed to echo Frank's prayer, reminding them all that sometimes the most unlikely souls could find their voices again. The late morning sun beat down on Frank's cabin as hoofbeats thundered up the trail. For deputies rode into the clearing, rifles ready. Sheriff Mills led them, his face set in grim lines beneath his dusty hat. Last chance, Boone, the sheriff, called out, "Hand over the horse, peaceful-like." Frank stood on his porch, arms crossed. "Can't do that, Sheriff. Bought him fair and legal." Ruth watched from the doorway, one hand pressed against the rough wood frame. Thomas huddled behind her skirts, his dark eyes wide with fear. The sheriff dismounted with a weary sigh. "Then you ain't leaving us much choice." He pulled iron shackles from his saddlebag, the metal catching harsh sunlight. "You're under arrest for theft and defying a lawful order." Two deputies flanked Frank, hands hovering near their pistols. Frank didn't resist as the cold iron closed around his wrists. He turned to Ruth, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Keep promise safe," he said softly, "and yourselves." Ruth clutched Thomas closer, fighting back tears as they led Frank to a waiting horse. The boy reached out one small hand toward Frank, but no words came. "Mount up," the sheriff ordered, helping Frank awkwardly into the saddle with his bound. Hand's dust billowed behind the deputies as they rode away. Frank's broad shoulders growing smaller until they disappeared around the bend. Ruth sank to her knees, holding Thomas as they both shook with silent sobs. Hours crawled by in the town jail. Frank sat alone on a narrow cot, the cell's iron bars casting long shadows across the plank floor. His fingers traced the worn pages. Of the small Bible Ruth had pressed into his hands before they took him away. "Lord," he whispered, "I've failed them all. Failed Sarah's memory too, letting anger rule instead of your wisdom." He closed his eyes, remembering his wife's gentle faith. "Show me the way through this darkness." The jail door creaked open. Clinton Maddox strode in, triumph gleaming in his cold eyes. "Mighty peaceful in here," Maddox sneered. "Gives a man time to think about his foolish choices." Frank said nothing, but his hands tightened on the Bible. "I'm riding out now to collect what's mine," Maddox continued. "That worthless nag ain't fit for nothing but a bullet. Better end than it deserves, truth be told." Frank's shoulders tensed, but still he held his tongue, praying silently for strength. Out at the cabin, Ruth heard horses approaching again. Her heart sank as Maddox appeared with 2 ranch hands, their rifles glinting in the afternoon light. "Where's the Mustang woman?" "He's not yours to take," Ruth said, forcing steel into her voice. Despite her fear, Maddox's face darkened. "Everything in this county belongs to me, one way or another, including that horse." He stepped closer, towering over her, and those who forget their place tend to regret it. Ruth backed away, but her chin stayed high. "We have rights, rights." Maddox laughed harshly. "Ask your half-breed boy about rights. Might be time someone reminded you both where you really belong." Ruth hurried into town as sunset painted the mountains gold, desperate for help. She went door to door, pleading her case to shopkeepers and ranchers' wives. Most turned away, muttering excuses. A few showed sympathy in their eyes, but shook their heads. Unwilling to cross Maddox, the saloon was crowded that evening, rough voices and piano music spilling into the street. Thomas crept along the boardwalk, drawn by angry words floating through. "The window ain't right. Having that Indian boy up there," a man growled. "Someone ought to take him back where he came from. Heard the Indian agent's due through next week." Another voice added, "Maybe he can sort it proper." Thomas's blood ran cold. He'd heard stories of children taken away, families torn apart. His small hands clenched into fists as fear and determination warred in his heart. The moon rose over Silver Bluff as Thomas slipped away from the cabin, silent as a shadow. He paused only to whisper a soft Apache prayer his father had taught him, then disappeared into the darkness. Dawn broke harsh and clear over the mountains. Ruth woke with a start, her neck stiff. From dozing in her chair, she'd waited all night for Thomas to emerge from behind his quilt. Thomas called softly, then louder as panic clawed at her throat. "Thomas." She threw back the quilt that sectioned off his sleeping area. The blankets lay cold and empty. A small wooden horse he'd been carving sat abandoned on his pillow. Ran outside, her voice echoing off the pines. "Thomas, Thomas, where are you?" Only silence answered. She sank to her knees in the dirt, her cry of anguish splitting the morning air like summer lightning. Promise shifted restlessly in the barn, as if sensing her distress. But Thomas was gone, leaving nothing but fear and emptiness in his wake. Thomas pressed himself against the cool canyon wall, his heart pounding like a frightened rabbit's. The stream beside him whispered secrets, reminding him of his father's teachings. He could almost hear the deep, gentle voice telling him how their people had lived in these hills for generations. "Watch the water, little one," his father had said. "It knows the way through stone." The boy's small hands traced the rough rock, remembering. His father had shown him how to find shelter, which plants were safe to eat, how to move without being seen. Thomas pulled his worn blanket tighter, grateful for the memories that felt like armor against his fear. Back in Silver Bluff, Ruth's boots echoed on the church steps as she rushed to find Reverend Matthews. She found him in his study, lamplight, pooling around his desk. "Please," she begged, voice breaking. "Thomas is gone. He heard talk of the Indian agent coming, and now," her words dissolved into tears. The preacher rose, his weathered face grave. "The Lord's hand is in this, Sister Ruth. We won't stand idle while a child suffers." He reached for his hat. There are good folks in town, though they've been quiet too long. Within an hour, Reverend Matthews had gathered a small group in the church basement. The baker's wife brought bread and coffee. The blacksmith stood with his arms crossed, muttering about Maddox's growing tyranny. The schoolteacher spoke of Thomas's gentle nature, how he'd watched the boy sketch horses in his primer. "It ain't right," the blacksmith declared. "Man thinks money makes him God's hand on earth." In the jail, Frank paced his cell like a caged wolf. Deputy Young slipped in, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "The boy's run off," he whispered. "Folk are saying he headed for the hills." Frank gripped the iron bars until his knuckles went white. He sank to his knees, pressing his forehead against the cold metal. "Lord," he prayed, his voice rough with emotion, "that boy's carrying enough scars. Guard him in the wilderness. Guide him like you guided your people through the desert." His shoulders shook. "Don't let my failure cost him everything." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the street as Maddox strode from the saloon. By his ranch hands, his spurs rang against the wooden sidewalk as he approached the livery where promise was being held. "Time to end this foolishness," he announced, checking his pistol. "No good letting bad stock poison the bloodlines." The stable boy watched with wide eyes as Maddox ordered Promise to be brought out. The Mustang's coat gleamed despite his scars. His head held high as they led him into the yard. Reverend Matthews stepped into the street, Bible in hand. Behind him gathered his small band of supporters, the blacksmith, the baker's wife, the schoolteacher, Courage, Clinton Maddox. The preacher's voice carried across the dusty street. "There's law written by men, and there's higher law written by God. Which will you answer to?" Maddox's face darkened. "Stand aside, preacher. This is business. This is about—" "More than a horse," Matthews continued. "It's about justice, about whether we'll let power trample mercy under its boots." More townspeople emerged from shops and houses, drawn by the confrontation. Torches flared to life as the sun sank behind the mountains, casting flickering shadows on worried faces. Up in the canyon, Thomas huddled deeper into his blanket as darkness crept between the rocks. He thought of Ruth's tears, of Frank's strong hands teaching him to split kindling, of Promise's soft nose nudging his shoulder. The stream murmured beside him, its voice like his father's stories of survival, of courage, of finding light in the darkest places. Thomas pressed his palm against the canyon wall, feeling the ancient strength of the stone. "Watch the water," he whispered to himself, his father's words a shield against the gathering night. "It knows the way through stone." In his cell, Frank kept praying as shadows lengthened across the floor. His words were simple now, worn smooth, like river rocks. "Lord, protect them all. Show us your path through this valley." The town held its breath as darkness fell. Torchlight danced on faces filled with fear and hope, casting wild shadows as Silver Bluff waited to see which law would prevail, man's or God's. The deputy's keys scraped softly in the lock as false dawn painted the jail windows gray. Frank jolted awake on his thin cot, instantly alert. "You've got one chance," Deputy Young whispered, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "Find that boy. Before something happens neither of us can fix." Frank rose without a word, his joints creaking from the cold cell floor. The deputy pressed a piece of paper into his rough palm. "My brother's got a horse waiting behind the livery. Go quick and quiet." The borrowed mare, a sturdy brown quarter horse, carried Frank swiftly through the sleeping streets. Her hooves kicked up dust as they left Silver Bluff behind, climbing into hills turned silver by starlight. Frank's heart hammered against his ribs, matching the horse's galloping rhythm. He searched methodically, drawing on years of tracking experience. The pre-dawn light revealed subtle signs, a disturbed patch of grass here, a scraped rock there. Thomas had covered his tracks well, using skills passed down through generations of his father's people. Pride mingled with worry in Frank's chest. The sun crested the eastern ridge as Frank discovered fresh signs near a narrow canyon. A thread from Thomas's blanket caught on a thorny bush made his breath catch. He dismounted, leading the horse carefully along the stream bank. "Thomas," his voice echoed off the canyon walls. "Son, you hear?" A small movement caught his eye, a flash of worn cloth against stone. Frank's heart clenched at the sight of the boy huddled against the canyon wall, shivering despite his blanket. Thomas's dark eyes were huge in his pale face, watching Frank with a mixture of longing and fear. "Steve, stay back," Thomas whispered, his voice hoarse. "They'll just make you send me away." Frank dropped to one knee, keeping his movements slow and gentle. "Nobody's sending you anywhere, son. You belong with us." Thomas shook his head fiercely. "I heard them talking about the Indian agent, about how mixed-blood children bring trouble." His small shoulders hunched. "Don't want to cause more problems for you and Miss Ruth, Thomas." Frank's voice broke on the name. "Listen close now. You ain't a problem. You're a blessing to me, and to Ruth both." The boy's lip trembled. "But Mr. Maddox said Maddox says a lot of things," Frank cut in, his tone firm but kind. "He said promise was worthless to remember, but we know different, don't we?" Thomas nodded slightly, his eyes filling with tears he refused to let fall. "Your wanted son." Frank inched closer, holding the boy's gaze. "You're loved, and you're safe with us, no matter what anyone says." He reached out one weathered hand. "We're family now, and family stands together." The tears finally spilled down Thomas's cheeks. His small frame shook with sobs held back too long. Frank gathered him close, feeling the boy's heart racing like a wild thing slowly accepting shelter. "I got you," Frank murmured, the words his wife had once used to comfort him echoing across years of grief. "I got you, son." When Thomas's tears slowed, Frank lifted him onto the borrowed horse. The boy's fingers clutched the saddle horn as Frank swung up behind him. Together they started down the canyon, Thomas gradually relaxing against Frank's chest. The morning sun climbed higher as they rode, warming the chill from their bones. Frank kept one arm protectively around Thomas, silently, giving thanks for the boy's safe return. But his relief turned to ash in his mouth as they crested a ridge overlooking Silver Bluff. Smoke rose from the direction of Maddox's ranch, where a crowd was gathering. Even at this distance, Frank could make out Promise's distinctive shape. Tethered in the yard, his gut twisted, knowing why Maddox had chosen such a public display. Thomas saw it too, his small body tensed. "They're going to hurt Promise, aren't they?" Frank tightened his hold on the reins. "Not if we can help it." He pressed his heels to the horse's flanks, steering them toward town. "Remember what I said about family standing together?" Thomas nodded, his chin set in a determined line that reminded Frank powerfully of Ruth. "Well then," Frank said quietly, "let's go stand for Promise." The borrowed mare carried them down the slope, her hooves raising dust that caught the morning, light like prayer, rising. Behind them, the canyon stood empty, its walls still holding echoes of tears and healing. Ahead, smoke climbed into the cloudless sky, marking where the next battle waited. Frank held Thomas close, feeling the boy's trust in every heartbeat. Whatever came next, this moment, this bond forged in darkness and sealed with tears, would not be broken. They rode on, father and son, in all but blood, toward whatever Providence had in store. Hooves thundered across packed earth as Frank and Thomas galloped toward Maddox's ranch. The morning sun cast long shadows across the yard where a crowd had gathered, their faces grim in the early light. Promise stood tethered to a post, head high despite his circumstances. The scarred Mustang's coat gleamed with new health, a testament to Frank's care. Clinton Maddox stood before the assembled townsfolk, his silver-handled pistol glinting. The wealthy rancher's mouth curved in a cruel smile as he gestured toward Promise. "This worthless animal was never properly sold. I aim to end this foolishness here and now." Frank reined the borrowed horse to a stop at the edge of the crowd. People turned, murmuring as they recognized him. Thomas clung tight to the saddle horn, his small face pale but determined. The preacher stood among the onlookers, his Bible clutched to his chest. Ruth pushed through to stand beside him, relief flooding her features at the sight of her son. "Safe with Frank. That horse is mine." Frank's deep voice carried across the yard as he dismounted. He lifted Thomas down, keeping one protective hand on the boy's shoulder. "Bought fair at auction, paid for with honest coin." Maddox's laugh cut, sharp as a blade. $1 for Colstock. "That's no proper sale." He raised the pistol, sighting along its barrel at Promise. "I'm within my rights to dispose of inferior stock." The crowd shifted uneasily. Promise stamped one hoof, his ears pricked forward as Frank stepped closer. The mountain man's worn boots left clear prints in the dust as he moved between Maddox And the horse? That dollar was legal tender, Frank said quietly. But more than that, this horse was given by Providence. His voice strengthened, given to protect and serve, not to be destroyed by pride. Providence, Maddox sneered. God has nothing to do with this mongrel beast. He kept the pistol steady, though his face flushed red with anger. Step aside, Boone, or you'll answer to the law. Thomas edged toward Promise, drawn by the horse's familiar presence. The boy's movement caught Maddox's eye, his lip curling at the sight of Thomas's Apache features. Keep that half-breed back. This is no place for his words cut off as Promise suddenly reared, front hooves slashing air. The crowd gasped, stumbling backward. But the horse wasn't spooked by Maddox's threat. Promise's eyes fixed on something near Thomas's feet, a thick diamondback rattler. Its scales dusty brown against the yard's packed earth. The snake's rattle buzzed, warning as it coiled, head weaving toward Thomas. The boy froze, terror widening. His eyes, before anyone could move, Promise lunged against his tether. The rope snapped with a sharp crack. In 2 powerful strides, the Mustang reached Thomas. His hooves struck with deadly precision, crushing the rattler's head mere inches. From the boy's boots, silence fell across the yard. Thomas stumbled back into Frank's arms as Promise stood over the dead snake, nostrils flaring. The Mustang's scarred hide quivered, but he held his ground, positioning himself between the boy and any threat. Well, now, the preacher's voice rang, out clear and strong. If that ain't Providence at work, I never saw it. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Women dabbed at tears. Men shifted uncomfortably. Even the sheriff looked away from Maddox's thunderous expression. They had all seen what Frank knew from the start. This was no worthless beast, but a creature of courage and heart. Frank stepped forward again, one arm still around Thomas. This horse was rejected, same as others here. His gaze swept the crowd, lingering on those who had mocked Promise at the auction. But God often works through the despised, doesn't he, preacher? Amen. The preacher nodded. The stone which the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. That's right. Frank's voice carried conviction born of his own journey from bitter grief to renewed faith. Promise here wasn't meant for your breeding stock, Maddox. He was meant to protect, to serve, to show us all that worth ain't measured in bloodlines or banknotes. The pistol in Maddox's hand wavered. Promise stood calm now, his head lowered to nuzzle Thomas's hair. The boy's small hand reached up to stroke the horse's velvet nose, tears tracking down his cheeks. You can't just, Maddox started, but his words faltered as more townspeople moved to stand with Frank. I reckon he can, the preacher said firmly. That horse is his, bought and paid for, and I'd say he's proved his worth clear as gospel truth. Ruth stepped forward to wrap her arms around Thomas. Promise nickered softly, remaining close to the boy he'd saved. The morning sun caught the horse's coat, turning old scars to silver, marking him as something transformed and precious. Frank met Maddox's furious gaze steadily. The wealthy rancher might own more horses than anyone in the territory, but in this moment, he had lost something worth far more than livestock or pride. He had lost the power to decide what and who held value in Silver Bluff. Ruth's hands trembled as she stepped forward into the tense silence. Dust swirled around her skirts, and morning light caught the yellowed papers she clutched. Her voice, usually soft, rang clear across the yard. Mr. Maddox, you speak of rights and proper sales. She smoothed the creased documents with careful fingers. My late husband, James Larkspur, he kept records of every horse he handled for your ranch. Maddox's face darkened. What nonsense is this? No nonsense, sir. Ruth held the papers toward the preacher. These show Promise's lineage. He wasn't your Colstock at all. He was born wild, captured legal, and sold through proper channels before you ever laid claim. The preacher took the documents, adjusting his spectacles as he studied them. His eyebrows rose as he read, then he cleared his throat. These papers bear Mr. Maddox's own mark, witnessed and dated 3 years past. They show clear as day that any rights to this bloodline were transferred to the Territory Auction Board. He raised his voice, reading the key passages aloud. All Mustang stock captured in the South Range, including their offspring, to be disposed of through legal auction as the board sees fit. The preacher looked up, his gaze stern. Your signature stands witness, Mr. Maddox. You surrendered any claim to these horses long ago. Townsfolk pressed closer, craning to see. Sheriff Graves shifted uncomfortably, fingering his badge. "Those papers are genuine." "They are," Ruth said firmly. "My James was honest to his bones. He recorded everything, kept every contract." Her chin lifted. "I reckon he knew truth might be needed someday." The sheriff squared his shoulders, duty finally overcoming his fear of Maddox's influence. "Then I'm ordering you to stand down, Maddox. That horse belongs to Frank Boone, purchased legal at auction." Maddox's face mottled red, his knuckles white on his pistol grip. For a long moment, he seemed ready to defy them all. But the crowd's mood had turned. Mothers drew children close, men crossed their arms, and the preacher stood resolute with Ruth's proof. In hand, finally, Maddox jammed his gun into its holster. "This ain't finished," he snarled, but his threat rang hollow. He swung onto his horse, spurring it, perhaps harder than needed as he rode away. A release of breath seemed to sweep through the gathered townsfolk. Several stepped forward to pat Promise's neck or offer quiet words to Frank. Others nodded respectfully to Ruth, seeing her in a new light. Thomas pressed close to his mother's side, managing a small smile as Promise nickered softly. The preacher raised his Bible, carrying across the yard, "This was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes." Sunlight caught the pages as he spoke, gilding them gold. "Let us remember today how truth prevails, and how the Almighty lifts up those the world would cast aside." Painted. The mountain peaks in shades of purple and gold as Frank, Ruth, and Thomas made their way back to the cabin. The familiar scent of pine needles welcomed them home, mixing with wood smoke curling from the chimney. Promise's hooves crunched softly on the path, his head held higher now, as if he too sensed the change in their fortunes. Ruth disappeared inside to prepare supper. The clatter of pots and the sweet aroma of cornbread soon drifting through the open door. Thomas stayed close to Frank as they led Promise to the barn, the boy's movements more confident than before. "Here now," Frank said, handing Thomas the curry brush. "Show me how you tend to him." Thomas took the brush with steady hands. No longer the trembling child who had arrived in that broken-down wagon, he worked methodically, speaking low and clear to Promise. "You're a brave horse," he murmured, smoothing the Mustang's coat, "just like my father's people say." Story. Frank watched them together, his heart full. Promise stood patient under Thomas's care. The marks of his past abuse now faded but visible, badges of survival rather than shame. The horse's eyes, once wild with fear, now showed trust and contentment. When they finished, Promise ambled out, to his favorite grazing spot in the meadow. The setting sun caught his coat, making him shine like burnished copper. Inside, Ruth had set the table with their best cloth. 3 plates arranged like families should be. They gathered around the worn oak table, the lamplight casting warm shadows on their faces. Frank cleared his throat, suddenly aware of the weight. Of this moment, for the first time since losing his wife, he felt ready, called even to lead in prayer. "Shall we bow our heads?" he asked softly. Ruth and Thomas nodded, their hands joining his. Frank's voice, rough with emotion, filled the quiet cabin. "Lord, we thank you for this food, and for so much more, for second chances we didn't deserve, for making the cast-off precious in your sight." He squeezed Thomas's small hand gently. "For family found when we thought we were alone, for your protection and providence. Amen, amen." Ruth and Thomas echoed, their voices strong and sure. After their meal, Frank stepped out onto the porch, drawn by the glory of stars scattered. Across the darkening sky, the ridge stood black against the heavens, familiar as an old friend. Ruth's footsteps whispered behind him, and then she was there, her presence as natural as breathing. Their hands found each other in the gathering dark, fingers intertwining without need for words. From the meadow, Promise's soft nicker floated, up like a benediction. Acknowledging the rightness of this moment, the cabin's lamplight spilled golden through the window, promising warmth and welcome. Inside, Thomas could be heard humming one of the hymns from church, his young voice carrying hope in every note. Together they stood, this unlikely family brought together by Providence and a dollar horse, their hearts full of gratitude for all that had been restored. If you believe stories can heal, lift, and connect us, this channel is for you. Thanks for being here. Hit subscribe, and I'll meet you again tomorrow with something real. Something real.